It's November, and for the first time since the election back in the spring, Canadians are finally seeing what this new government actually plans to do with the country's money. That's right. We've gone nearly half a year without a federal budget. No roadmap, no fiscal anchor, just political promises, vague reassurances, and a lot of Canadians wondering who, if anyone, is actually steering the ship. And that's what makes this budget such a big deal. It's not just another 400-page policy document. It's the first full statement of direction since the Liberals collapsed, Mark Carney took over, and the opposition benches, led by Pierre Poilievre, began preparing for a long political fight. For months, Ottawa's been running on autopilot. Departments funded by temporary supply bills, programs waiting for renewal, provinces holding their breath. Now, finally, we have a plan, or at least the government's version of one. But before we dig into what's inside, let's start with the basics. What is a federal budget? What does it mean when a country runs a deficit? And how do we know if the deficit is smart, necessary, or just reckless? Then we'll look at what a good budget usually looks like, what responsible governments have done in the past when times are tough. After that, we'll go line by line through the 2025 budget itself, where the money's going, how it's being paid for, and what it tells us about where Canada is headed. And of course, we'll talk about the politics, because this document isn't being read in a vacuum. It's being challenged by Pierre Poilievre, who's betting Canadians are tired of deficits and debt. It's being defended by Prime Minister Mark Carney, the former central banker turned Prime Minister, who says this is an investment in the next generation. And it's being scrutinized by Don Davies and the NDP, who argue it's not enough, that Canada still needs to spend more on healthcare, affordability, and working people. So today, we'll break it all down. What a budget is, what this one says, and what it means for you. And how this late, long-awaited plan reveals not just economic priorities, but the political battle lines that will define the next few years of Canadian life. Because when a country runs this long without a budget, it does tell you something, not just about its finances, but about its leadership, its stability, and its direction. What a federal budget is, and what a deficit is. When you strip away the jargon, a federal budget is really just Ottawa's annual blueprint. It's the plan for how much money the government expects to collect through taxes, fees, and crown revenues, how much it plans to spend on programs and transfers, and how much it needs to borrow to make the math work. It's more than a spreadsheet. It's the government's statement of priorities, backed by hundreds of pages of projections, tables, and laws that authorize spending, according to the Department of Finance Canada. A deficit simply means the government is spending more than it brings in during a single year. A surplus means the opposite. Canada tracks this through the public accounts, which are basically the country's fiscal report cards, the official record of what the government actually spent and earned each year. Now, a lot of people like to compare the federal budget to a household budget, and in some ways, that analogy really does work. Both households and governments have to make trade-offs. They decide how much to spend, how much to save, and how much debt they can live with. A family that spends too much risks losing its home. A government that spends too much risks losing credibility. That's why politicians love the comparison. It sounds responsible. It makes fiscal prudence relatable. Pierre Poilievre often says if Canadian families have to balance their budgets, so should the government. It's a powerful, simple line. But it's also not the full story. A family doesn't issue bonds, set interest rates, or control its own currency. Ottawa can do all three. A family can't roll its mortgage forever. A country can, as long as people trust its finances. And there's another difference. Purpose. When a family goes into debt, it's usually to buy something personal, a home, a car, an education. When a government borrows, it can be to build public goods that last generations. Hospitals, highways, power grids, transit systems. Those things don't just cost money, they can make money by increasing productivity and growth over time. That's why the real question isn't should a government ever run a deficit, but rather, what are we getting for it? Because when debt is used to fund consumption, it just buys time. But when it's used to fund production, things that make future generations richer, safer, and more capable, it can actually be an investment. That said, the household analogy holds true in one critical way: trust. If a family starts missing payments, the bank raises its rates. If a government starts losing credibility, the bond market does the exact same thing. That's why interest costs, the price of all that borrowed money, are now one of Ottawa's fastest growing expenses. The 2025 budget projects $64 billion in public debt charges this year, more than we'll spend on national defense, according to the Department of Finance. So is a government budget like a household budget? Only partly. The difference is scale, tools, and the time horizon. A family plans for one lifetime. A government plans for generations. And in both cases, the foundation is the same: trust. And once that's gone, everything else gets more expensive. This year's budget stands out not just for what's inside it, but for how long it took to get here. After the spring election, Canada went nearly half a year without a formal federal budget, running instead on temporary supply bills and interim funding while the new government found its footing. In other words, Ottawa was flying on autopilot, with departments and provinces waiting for clarity on where the country was heading, according to the CBC News. So what does a good budget look like? Economists usually agree on three things. First, there needs to be a fiscal anchor, a clear rule that keeps spending within limits. That could mean a target to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, or a commitment to balance the operating budget within a few years. In the 2025 plan, the Carney government says it will keep the deficit on a declining share of GDP and aims to balance day-to-day spending by 2028-2029. But the parliamentary budget officer and outside economists warned that math doesn't quite line up. The debt ratio could stay flat or even rise without more restraint, according to the PBO. The second ingredient is realism. The budget's projections should line up with independent forecasts and be resilient to shocks. The IMF calls this one of the hallmarks of responsible budgeting, and Canadian think tanks like the IRPP have noted that recent budgets often rely on optimistic growth assumptions that leave little room for error. And the third is balance between investing for the future and protecting against downturns. That means setting aside contingency reserves, keeping day-to-day spending under control, and focusing investment on things that actually raise productivity and long-term growth. It's the old idea that governments should spend for tomorrow, not just survive today. If you look back, both liberal and conservative governments have claimed that mantle of responsibility, with very different styles. Under Stephen Harper, the Conservatives ran deep deficits during the 2008 financial crisis, then tightened spending and brought the books back to balance. By 2014-15, Canada actually recorded a $1.9 billion surplus, and the 2015 budget projected another surplus for the following year. When the Liberals came in, they reversed course. Justin Trudeau's first budget in 2016 promised modest deficits to stimulate growth, but the red ink kept flowing. Then COVID hit, and those deficits exploded. peaking at over $327 billion in 2020, before narrowing to around $52 billion by 2023, according to Statistics Canada. The 2024 plan promised a gradual path back towards balance and stable debt ratio, projections the PBO later called overly optimistic. Now, in 2025, we have a new government under Mark Carney, the former Bank of Canada governor turned Prime Minister, introducing its first full plan since taking office. The budget projects a $78.3 billion deficit, about 2.5% of GDP, with what Carney calls generational investments in infrastructure, defense, and green energy. Supporters say it's a pragmatic response to weak growth and U.S. tariffs. Critics, including Pierre Poilievre and the NDP MP Don Davies, argue it's just another decade of debt with a new coat of paint. A good budget, at least in theory, should tell a story about priorities and discipline, where the government wants to go and how it plans to get there without losing credibility along the way. Canada's had 10 straight years of Liberal budgets since Harper left office, and this one may be the most consequential of them all, because after so much spending and so many promises and so little fiscal breathing room left, the question now isn't just whether Canada can afford these choices, it's whether Canadians still believe they're worth it, what the 2025 budget says, and where it takes Canada. The 2025 budget opens with a grand narrative that Canada needs to become stronger, more self-sufficient, and more resilient to an uncertain world. The government describes it as a plan for generational investment, a response to global instability, trade shifts, and the economic pressure created by U.S. tariffs. At the core of this document are two fiscal anchors. First, the government aims to balance day-to-day or operating spending with revenues by 2028-29. Second, it promises to maintain a declining deficit to GDP ratio over the projected period. But the numbers tell a more complicated story. The deficit for 25-26 is projected at that $78.3 billion, about 2.5% of GDP, and deficits are expected to remain above $50 billion each year for at least the next 4 years. Analysts from RBC, Deloitte, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer have already questioned whether the debt ratio will actually decline or simply flatten. If that happens, it would mean Canada is effectively standing still on fiscal discipline while interest payments continue to climb. In short, this is a high-spending, high-debt plan that bets heavily on future growth to make today's borrowing look wise tomorrow. The centerpiece of the budget is infrastructure. The government describes it as the backbone of a stronger Canada. About $115 billion is being committed over 5 years, with an additional $25 billion specifically targeted at housing. The flagship measure is the Build Communities Strong Fund, worth $51 billion over 10 years, starting in 2026-27. That fund includes a $17 billion provincial and territorial stream to support local infrastructure tied to housing and transit. There's also renewed focus on Indigenous housing and infrastructure. The budget acknowledges unique and persistent challenges facing Indigenous communities, though many First Nations and Métis leaders have already said the funding alone won't fix the structural gaps. These projects are ambitious and long-term. The economic payoff, new jobs, construction activity, and expanded housing supply will likely take years to appear. The financial cost, however, starts immediately. Still, the government is betting that this construction wave will become a political lifeline, evidence that the Carney government is doing something tangible about affordability. Critics argue that while cranes will fill skylines in the coming years, few Canadians struggling with rent or mortgages today will feel any immediate relief. Another major theme is a national defense and industrial self-reliance. The budget ties these two ideas together under the banner of Canada Strong. Over $81 billion is earmarked for defense and security over 5 years, not just for military procurement, but for a broader defense industrial strategy designed to boost domestic manufacturing in aerospace, clean technology, and artificial intelligence. This marks a shift in how Ottawa is thinking about defense. It's not just about military readiness, it's also about using defense spending to create high-tech jobs at home. In that sense, the government is borrowing a page from the American playbook, blending economic policy with national security. Supporters see this as a smart industrial policy. Critics argue it risks blurring the line between national security and corporate subsidy, especially when much of the spending will benefit major contractors and defense manufacturers rather than ordinary Canadians. At the same time, the budget subtly links defense spending with trade diversification. After a year of escalating U.S. tariffs, Ottawa is pushing to reduce reliance on the American market, diversify exports, and expand domestic production capacity. That's the political subtext: independence through industry. One of the most politically charged parts of the budget comes in the fine print: climate and energy policy. The government quietly signaled that the planned federal emissions cap on oil and gas could be eliminated or delayed if industry meets targets through carbon pricing and technology. To offset that shift, the budget expands carbon capture, utilization, and storage tax credits, effectively subsidizing major industrial projects like Alberta's Pathways Alliance. For environmentalists, this reads like a retreat, a step back from climate promises. For Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's relief, a recognition that energy still matters to Canada's economic survival. That balancing act between green commitments and resource realities will likely define much of the debate in the coming months ahead. The government argues that Canada's long-term challenges isn't just inflation or interest rates, it's productivity. Canadians are working hard but producing less value per hour than many peer countries. The budget allocates roughly $110 billion over 5 years to improve productivity, competitiveness, and trade diversification. That includes investment in advanced manufacturing, AI, and green technology, new incentives for research partnerships and innovation hubs, tax reforms like adjusting rules for trusts and qualified investments and eliminating certain luxury levies to encourage capital investment, a plan to reduce immigration targets from 673,000 in 2025 to 385,000 in 2026 with the goal of rebalancing the labor market and easing housing pressure. Those immigration changes are one of the quiet but consequential parts of this budget, a recognition that Canada's record population growth has collided with a limited housing supply and strained infrastructure. Business groups are warning it could hurt labor availability, while many Canadians see it as long overdue realism. The government calls for this mix of innovation, tax change, and demographic control, a modern industrial strategy. But the results will depend on execution. Economists note that Canada's productivity has stagnated despite years of similar initiatives. Spending billions, again, doesn't guarantee different results unless regulations, taxes, and incentives are truly changed. To offset the new spending, the budget claims it will find $60 billion in savings and additional revenues through what it calls a comprehensive expenditure review. The plan assumes a gradual reduction in the size of the public service, back to roughly 2021 levels by 2028 to 2029, and a focus on measuring outcomes rather than inputs. The challenge is credibility. Every government promises efficiency, and few deliver it. Analysts at RBC and the PBO note that these savings depend on optimistic assumptions about economic growth and administrative reform that rarely materialize. Public sector unions are already warning that cuts of this scale could lead to service reductions in health, immigration processing, and Indigenous affairs. Still, the message is clear. The Carney government wants to frame itself as fiscally responsible, willing to spend big, but also to cut back where it can. Whether that balance can actually be achieved remains to be seen. For everyday Canadians, the headline issue isn't just the size of the deficit, it's what it means for the cost of living. Interest on federal debt is now one of Ottawa's fastest growing expenses. The 2025 budget projects $64 billion in annual debt servicing costs, more than the country spends on national defense. That number matters because it limits what future governments can do. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar that can't go to healthcare, housing, or tax relief. Affordability measures focus mostly on long-term fixes, more housing, infrastructure, productivity, rather than short-term relief. There's little in the way of direct help for families struggling with groceries or rent today. That's one of the biggest points of contention in Parliament, whether generational investments justify ignoring the immediate pain. The government is betting that growth will return, that higher productivity will eventually ease inflationary pressures, and the voters will reward patience. But if inflation or rates tick upward again, the fiscal room to respond will be dangerously small. Every budget is political theater, and this one is no exception. It's the first full plan from Prime Minister Mark Carney, the former Bank of Canada governor, now recast as global-minded technocrat, trying to rebuild trust and competence. The Conservatives, led by Pierre Poilievre, have called the plan reckless and inflationary, arguing that Canadians are paying for a decade of liberal overspending and that the so-called generational investments are just new labels on old problems. The NDP's Don Davies has taken a different stance, supporting the spending on housing and healthcare, but arguing that it doesn't go far enough to address inequality, corporate concentration, or wage stagnation. Add to that the regional divide. Alberta and Saskatchewan are skeptical of federal direction. Quebec and Ontario want guarantees on housing and infrastructure dollars. Atlantic premiers say they've been left out of the national strategies yet again. For a budget called Canada Strong, the pushback from provinces show how fragile national consensus has become. So where is this taking us now? The budget paints a picture of a Canada that is more industrial, more independent, and more interventionist, one that borrows now to invest in future strength. It moves away from the minimalist government approach of the Harper years towards something closer to a post-war reconstruction or modern European social capitalism. If the budget projections hold, Canada's debt will stabilize around 45% of GDP by the end of the next decade, with growth hovering around 2%. But those assumptions rely on global stability, moderate inflation, and investor confidence, none of which are guaranteed. And politically, this budget sets the stage for the next election. Carney's Liberals casting themselves as the builders of a new Canada. Poilievre's Conservatives as the protectors of fiscal sanity, and the NDP pushing to make sure ordinary Canadians see some of the payoff. In reality, it's a gamble, and these massive investments in housing, infrastructure, and defense will generate enough growth to justify the debt. If they do, Mark Carney could be remembered as the man who rebuilt Canada's economic engine. If they don't, he'll be remembered as the one who bet the house on hope. Either way, the direction is set. Canada is doubling down on spending as a strategy, betting that we can build our way to stability. The question for Canadians now isn't just whether this plan will work, it's whether we can afford the cost of finding out. The politics of the budget. Let's talk about the politics behind the 2025 budget. Because this isn't just another fiscal document, it's a political battlefield. And depending on how the next few weeks go, it could decide whether Canada heads into another election. This is Prime Minister Mark Carney's first full budget. It's branded Canada Strong and framed as blueprint for more self-sufficient, resilient, and independent country. Carney is selling it as a generational investment, a way to retool Canada's economy, protect against global instability, and respond to U.S. tariffs that have shaken key export sectors. But the strategy comes with a massive price tag. The deficit for 2025-26 is a projected $78.3 billion, about 2.5% of GDP. And over the next 4 years, those deficits are expected to stay above $50 billion annually. Carney says that's manageable, a deliberate trade-off to protect jobs and build the foundations of long-term growth. But economists from RBC, Deloitte, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer have already warned that the government's claim that the debt to GDP ratio will decline may not hold. If it just flattens, it means we're treading water on fiscal discipline, even as interest payments keep climbing. This is a high-spending, high-debt plan that bets heavily on future growth to make today's borrowing look smart for tomorrow, and that's where the politics start. Carney's pitch is straightforward. He believes Canada can't cut its way to strength. It has to build its way there. Defense, infrastructure, productivity, those are his three pillars. He argues that borrowing today to strengthen supply chain, energy systems, and industrial capacity is the only responsible path in a world where protectionism is back. That's the technocrats' logic. Borrow big now, stabilize later. But it's also risky politics. Carney's budget relies on the promise that Canada will grow its way out of debt. And that kind of confidence doesn't just require math, it requires trust. The government strategy also got a little boost this week when Conservative MP Chris D'Entremont crossed the floor to join the Liberals, tightening the minority gap. Then, a few days later, Conservative MP Matt Journeau resigned his seat, narrowing it even more. In a minority parliament, those two moves matter. They make it just a bit easier for Carney to survive the coming confidence vote. Now on the other side, you've got Pierre Poilievre, and he's crystal clear. He's voting no. Poilievre says Canadians need an affordable budget for an affordable life. And to him, that means no more deficits. He's framing this budget as reckless, inflationary, and proof that the Liberals have learned nothing after a decade of overspending. Poilievre argues that every dollar Ottawa borrows is a dollar that drives up interest rates, drives up inflation, and makes life harder for families. His message is moral as much as economic. If Canadian families have to live within their means, so should government. His campaign-style speeches have been full of that contrast. He stands in front of grocery stores and food banks saying families are tightening their belts. Why can't Ottawa? It's simple, populist, and emotionally resonant. And it's working. To Poilievre, this budget isn't just bad policy, it's the embodiment of liberal failure, bloated bureaucracy, endless deficits, and a government that refuses to stop spending other people's money. Then there's Don Davies. Speaking for the NDP, his tone has been cautious. He said he might support the budget, but that he needs to read it carefully before making a final decision. That hesitation tells you everything you need to know. The NDP is in a delicate position. They don't want to be seen as enabling Liberal overspending, but they also don't want to trigger an election they aren't ready for. Davies' message is that deficits aren't inherently bad if the money goes into helping people, if it funds housing, healthcare, and affordability. But what makes him nervous is how much of this budget leans towards corporate subsidy, defense contracts, industrial tax credits, and big business green incentives. He's hinted that he could support it if the Liberals deliver tangible social benefits alongside their industrial agenda. In other words, spend for people, not for corporations. If Carney throws the NDP a few key concessions on health, housing, or worker protections, Davies might abstain, allowing the budget to pass. That's the real calculation here. Not support or oppose, but vote or stay home. Then you've got Elizabeth May and the Green Party. She didn't mince words. Asked whether she'd vote against the budget, she said absolutely. May's issue isn't just the deficit, it's what the money is being spent on. The Greens say they cannot support this budget without significant amendments. For May, the problem is credibility on climate, on fiscal responsibility, and on long-term sustainability. She's made it clear she doesn't want an election, but she won't rubber stamp a budget that expands fossil fuel subsidies under the guise of green investment. And that brings us to one of the most controversial parts of the document, the climate file. Buried deep in the fine print, the government signaled that its planned emissions cap on oil and gas could be eliminated or delayed if the industry meets targets through technology and carbon pricing. In its place, the budget expands carbon capture tax credits, a clear nod to major oil producers and provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan. Environmentalists call it a retreat. Industry calls it common sense. The Liberals are now trying to straddle both worlds, funding clean tech while quietly giving traditional energy more breathing room. For Elizabeth May, that's a deal breaker. For Mark Carney, it's political necessity. Meanwhile, the Bloc Québécois, led by Yves-François Blanchet, didn't even pretend to be on the fence. Their response: we're as close to the Liberals as Quebec is to New Zealand. They're voting no. Their critique is familiar. The budget spends big, but doesn't spend for Quebec. To them, this is another Ottawa-centric plan that ignores Quebec's priorities on language, culture, and autonomy. They see the Canada Strong slogan as code for Quebec will decide for you. So you can take the Bloc off the list for possible allies. When you put all that together, the floor crossing, the resignation, the party lines, the math in Parliament is razor thin. If the Conservatives and Bloc both vote no, and the Greens join them, Carney's survival depends almost entirely on what the NDP does. If Don Davies and his caucus vote yes, the Liberals survive easily. If they vote no, the government falls. If they abstain, the budget squeaks through, just barely. That's what this all comes down to. In Canada's parliamentary system, a confidence vote is exactly what it sounds like, a test of whether the government still has the confidence of the House of Commons. Budgets are always confidence votes. If the government loses, it must either resign or ask the Governor General to dissolve Parliament and call an election. That's why every MP's vote or abstention matters. The main budget vote is expected around November 17th. And insiders are calling it one of the closest confidence tests in years. If even a handful of MPs break ranks, Canada could be headed into a snap election, barely months after the last one. So what do each of these leaders actually believe about deficits? For Mark Carney, deficits are a tool, acceptable, even necessary if they finance transformation. His mantra is invest now, balance later. For Poilievre, deficits are poison, the root of inflation, the cause of high interest rates, and the reason Canadians can't get ahead. His answer: balance the budget to make an affordable life again. For Don Davies, deficits are fine, as long as they serve people, not corporations. He's willing to run red ink if it builds homes or expands healthcare. For Elizabeth May, deficits are tolerable only if they build a climate-safe future. Borrowing to delay an energy transition is a moral failure. And for Yves Francois Blanchet, if it doesn't matter what the deficit funds, if it doesn't serve Quebec, the answer is no. The climate file isn't the only political lightning rod. The defense budget, $81 billion, is another. Is that national security or corporate subsidy in camouflage? The immigration reset, lowering targets from 673,000 to 385,000, is already causing debate between business leaders who fear labor shortages and Canadians who see it as long overdue. Then there's the promise of $60 billion in savings from a comprehensive expenditure review. Analysts say that number looks optimistic at best, imaginary at worst. And finally, regional tensions. Provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan say this budget doesn't respect the realities of energy production, while Quebec claims it doesn't respect provincial autonomy. A budget called Canada Strong has somehow managed to make every region feel slightly misunderstood. So where does that leave us? Carney's Liberals are betting that Canadians want competence, stability, and a sense of forward motion, even if it costs more today. Poilievre's Conservatives are betting that Canadians are fed up and ready to trade ambition for accountability. Don Davies' NDP is trying to thread the needle, extracting gains for working people while avoiding a snap election. Elizabeth May's Greens are drawing a climate line in the sand, and the Bloc, they're just waiting for Quebec to get its way. Here's the risk. If this budget passes, Canada enters a new phase. High spending, high ambition, and high risk. If it fails, we head back to the polls, likely before Christmas. Either way, the politics of this moment reveal something deeper about the country. That we're still arguing about what kind of nation we want to be, cautious and balanced, or bold and borrowed. And like every confidence vote in Canadian history, it all comes down to one question. Who do we trust to spend our money? And what kind of future are we willing to buy with it? What Canadians can do based on this budget? Let's bring this down from Parliament Hill to the dinner table, because for most Canadians, the federal budget isn't an abstract document. It's a question. Does any of this make my life easier? Does it help me buy a home? Does it help make groceries more affordable? Does it make a paycheck go further? Or is it just another promise that looks great in a press release, but changes nothing about where it counts, the kitchen counter, the rent check, the monthly statement? So let's go through it, piece by piece. The government's made housing the centerpiece of the budget, $25 billion in new funding and over $115 billion in broader infrastructure spending. They've launched something called the Build Communities Strong Fund. It's supposed to finance water, roads, and transit systems that make it easier for cities to build new homes. That's good policy. You can't build housing if you don't have pipes, permits, or power. They're also doubling down on financing for rental construction, expanding tax breaks for developers who build long-term affordable units, and providing money for municipalities that speed up zoning approvals. On paper, it looks like the most ambitious housing push in decades. But the fine print says most of the money starts flowing in 2026 or later. So if you're a renter watching your monthly bill rise by hundreds of dollars, this budget won't save you this year. It's aimed at solving the problem for the next generation, not the one that's already in it. That's the hard truth about housing policy. You can't fix a supply crisis overnight. Even if every promise here works exactly as intended, new homes take years to approve, years to build, and years to filter down to affordability. And in the meantime, interest rates are still high, mortgage renewals are painful, and the dream of homeownership is slipping further from reach. If you're under 40 and trying to buy, this budget's message to you is hang tight, we're working on it. but patience doesn't pay the rent. Now let's talk about the cost of living, the issue that defines every political conversation in the country right now. Groceries, gas, childcare, utilities, everything feels like it costs more, and for the average household, it does. This budget doesn't deliver any new checks, rebates, or one-time relief programs. No grocery rebate, no GST top-up. The government says that was intentional. They don't want to pour more cash into an economy already fighting inflation. Instead, they're betting on something slower. The investment-led growth will ease the pressure over time. That's a hard sell when you're in the checkout line. When your grocery bill is $400 and your credit card's carrying a balance, investment-led growth sounds like something that happens in someone else's life. So let's be honest. If you're looking for immediate relief, this budget doesn't have it. There are no short-term fixes for food, fuel, or rent. What it offers is the long-term play. Build more homes, grow productivity, lower structural costs, and trust that prices will stabilize. That might make economic sense, but politically, it's a gamble because people don't live in fiscal forecasts. They live in the here and now. So does the budget help with inflation? Indirectly, maybe. There's no new round of stimulus spending that would make inflation worse, and the deficit, while large, is expected to shrink as a share of the economy, which should calm bond markets and help make the Bank of Canada hold rates steady. But here's the catch. The government's still borrowing tens of billions each year, and every dollar borrowed adds to the debt. That debt now comes with an annual interest bill of roughly $64 billion, more than we spend on national defense. That means if interest rates stay high longer than expected, Ottawa's fiscal room to cut taxes or expand programs gets smaller. So while this budget doesn't stoke inflation, it also doesn't give the Bank of Canada much reason to lower rates faster. For Canadians with mortgages up for renewal, that's bad news. For those carrying credit card debt or small business loans, it's worse. If inflation stays sticky and rates stay high, households are going to feel the squeezed long after the headlines fade. There are a few bright spots worth noting. The budget's investments in advanced manufacturing, AI, and clean energy are meant to position Canada for the next wave of jobs, the kind that pay well and can't be easily outsourced. There's new funding for research partnerships, skilled trade apprenticeships, and energy infrastructure that could boost employment in construction, tech, and engineering fields. If you work in those sectors or plan to, this budget might open doors down the line. But again, most of those benefits are delayed. They rely on multi-year project timelines and public-private coordination that Canada doesn't always execute well. So while there are potential gains for tomorrow's workforce, there's not much immediate help for today's households. So what about taxes? There's no major change to income tax brackets or rates, but there are adjustments to trust and investment rules aimed at wealthy Canadians and a new round of enforcement measures to close loopholes. For the middle class, that means things will mostly stay the same. No new tax breaks, but no new taxes either. What the budget does really rely on, though, is something we rarely talk about: inflationary tax creep. When prices rise, wages rise too, and as incomes climb, more Canadians move into higher tax brackets, even if their purchasing power hasn't changed. The government calls that progressive taxation. Most Canadians call it what it feels like a quiet pay cut. So what can Canadians actually do in response to this budget? First, get informed about timelines. If you're a renter or homeowner waiting for affordability programs, check which initiatives start when. Some municipal and CMHC programs will begin next year, but most of the housing infrastructure money doesn't hit until 2026. Second, prepare for rates to stay high a bit longer. The budget's fiscal profile suggests the government is comfortable living with elevated borrowing costs for another year or two. If you're renewing a mortgage or carry variable debt, plan accordingly. Third, watch your province and city. Much of the new housing and infrastructure spending depends on provincial and municipal cooperation. The real impact will vary dramatically depending on where you live. Fourth, engage politically, especially with your MP. Minority governments live or die by public pressure. If there's a program you care about, housing, small business, childcare, energy, reach out. Tell your representatives what's working and what's not, because in a minority parliament, even a small groundswell of public opinion can shape amendments or future funding. And finally, stay realistic. Budgets are not magic. They're a mix of math and messaging. This one paints a vision of a country that builds its way out of a crisis rather than cuts its way through it. But for everyday Canadians, the results will be slow, uneven, and far from guaranteed. So does this budget address the housing crisis? Eventually, yes, but probably not fast enough. Does it tackle the cost of living crisis? Not directly. It's trying to fix the causes, not the symptoms. Does it fight inflation? In theory, yes. In practice, it just hopes the Bank of Canada finishes the job. For now, what it really offers Canadians is a promise that by spending wisely today, the country will be stronger for tomorrow. But as history shows, promises don't pay the bills. What Canadians can do is hold every party accountable for delivering on the parts of this plan that matters most. Homes people can afford, jobs that pay enough to live, and a cost of living that doesn't punish hard work. Because if the budget really is about building a stronger Canada, it can't just start in Ottawa. It has to start at home, at the dinner table, in the grocery aisle, and in the choices Canadians make every single day. Conclusion. When you strip away the spin, the 2025 budget is really a mirror. It reflects what Canada is, what it wants to be, and what it's willing to risk to get there. Mark Carney is betting on discipline through ambition, that you can spend big today and still be trusted tomorrow. Pierre Poilievre is betting that Canadians are done believing in that kind of optimism, that what they really want is restraint, responsibility, and results. Don Davies is betting that social investment is the only real way out. The budgets should be moral documents, not just fiscal ones. And somewhere between those visions sits a country trying to decide whether it still trusts its institutions enough to keep borrowing on the promise of progress. This budget won't fix the housing crisis next year. It won't cut your grocery bill. It won't make mortgages suddenly affordable again. What it might do, if executed well, is give Canada a more productive, resilient foundation a decade from now. But that's a hard sell to a country that's tired of waiting, because people don't live in economic models, they live in months, not decades. And after 10 years of Liberal budgets, many Canadians feel like they've been promised transformation without ever seeing the payoff. That's the quiet danger behind the plan. Not just fiscal fatigue, but moral fatigue. The sense that government can spend endlessly and still call it progress. If this budget succeeds, it could reset Canada's trajectory and prove that long-term investments still work in a short-term world. If it fails, it will cement the belief that Ottawa no longer knows how to deliver, only how to spend. The real question, then, isn't whether this budget balances the books, it's whether it balances something harder. The hope of a country that still wants to believe its leaders can build without breaking trust in the process. Because budgets come and go, but trust, once lost, takes generations to rebuild. And if this budget is truly about building a stronger Canada, that's where the work begins.